And good afternoon. There we go. It's recording. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss trauma-informed organizations. My name is Michelle Sermon, and I am a social worker practitioner with more than 12 years of experience supporting individuals recovering from trauma. I am also an assistant professor of social work and social work researcher with roots in the rural South, where I examine the impact of racial trauma on the well-being of rural African Americans. Over the course of my career, I've also worked with organizations to create systemic change through trauma-informed strategies. My pronouns are she, her, and for a visual description, I'm an African American woman with dark brown eyes and salt and pepper locks that frame my face. I'm wearing glasses and a black shirt. I'm speaking to you today from Memphis, Tennessee, the ancestral home of the Chickasaw Nation, and I acknowledge the forced, uncompensated centuries-long labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants, whose dehumanization and sacrifice contributed to the prosperity of this nation. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So before we get started, I wanted to review the agenda of what we'll be talking about today. First, I'll introduce the goals and objectives of this session. Then I'll discuss trauma, define trauma-informed concepts, and introduce you to trauma-informed organizational strategies. We'll wrap up with a question and answer session, and I'll share a list of resources for you to use for future reference. So, what are today's goals and objectives? Well, the goal for this session, there's only one, is to explore trauma-informed concepts and strategies that lead to systemic change in organizations. So I will accomplish this goal by equipping you with a general understanding of trauma, what it means to have a trauma-informed approach, and related strategies. I'll also inspire you to imagine your role in creating systemic change through your collaboration with and work in trauma-informed organizations. So I may be reaching a bit with this slide, but I wanted to bring it up because I wanted to understand where everyone is with regards to how we see trauma. I've been doing this work a long time, but I've seen how trauma has infiltrated into mainstream dialogues, especially since COVID and the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. Today, it seems like trauma is everywhere. So as you consider this idea of trauma, what comes to mind first? Is it how trauma has infiltrated pop culture? Because we hear it now in our music, we're seeing it on television and in movies. Or would it be how trauma has become a buzzword, where everybody seems to be talking about trauma in social media and places like that with little context for what trauma really is? Or are we just overusing this term trauma? Has the reality of what people experience when people experience trauma lost its true meaning? So I have this short clip I want us to take a look at that expresses an interesting sentiment about trauma.
Do you, Brett, as my friend and not speaking as the dean of Osler, think that we should pause the semester because some students are having bad dreams?
Well, I haven't had one of these dreams, so I can't speak to the...
No, don't say lived experience.
But it sounds like they've actually been traumatized.
Trauma is a trend these days. It is a joke. Everything is trauma. Arguing with a friend is trauma. Getting bad grades is trauma. They need to grow up.
So that was a very short clip from the movie Dream Scenario, starring Nicolas Cage. In this particular scene, he's a professor and he's grown somewhat frustrated with the response of his students to dreams that they have been having about him. I'm not trying to spoil the movie for those who haven't seen it. But so I'm curious about where you stand. So let's take a poll. Do you agree that trauma is a trend? Or that trauma is, that everything is trauma now, or that trauma is being overused and meaningless? Let's take just a few seconds and see where everybody stands. So let's see, have a lot of responses so far. And it looks like the vast majority of us believe that trauma is not a trend, that everything is not trauma. And almost half and half on, we're most feeling that trauma is has not been overused and has not lost its meaning. That's encouraging, I think, because we do hear so much about it. It just makes me wonder where everyone stands. So this is great. This is great feedback. So thank you for sharing. So considering where we stand, that trauma is not a trend, that trauma is not everything, and that trauma has not yet lost its meaning and not being overused, I think we're all starting in a great place. So let's talk about trauma and examine the realities of traumatic experiences, symptoms, and outcomes. Okay, so trying to catch up. Okay. Dr. Resma Menakem is a social work scholar and trauma expert, and I find his work with trauma to be fascinating. He not only looks at trauma as what happened to an individual, but he uses a systems approach to explain how untreated trauma, when it's taken out of context, impacts whole communities. He says that trauma in a person decontextualized over time can look like personality. And trauma in a family decontextualized over time can look like family traits. Trauma in a people decontextualized over time can look like culture. So, in other words, symptoms of untreated trauma over time and without context become normalized, internalized, and potentially harmful, becomes indistinguishable from culture and a way of life. And that's when it gets scary, when folks get desensitized to trauma. So it's good to see that this community is not yet in that space. Okay. So let's take a deeper dive into understanding trauma through the trauma process. So in general, the trauma process starts with some type of exposure that is perceived as life-altering or life-threatening. If the exposure is prolonged and persistent, the trauma is potentially more complex. After the exposure, the individual responds. The response may be physical, emotional, psychological, or it may even be a primal response where it's not even a consideration, it just happens. The response just happens. This triggers traumatic stress, and your body responds intuitively to protect the individual from harm. Finally, if the response is left untreated, symptoms develop over time that lead to poor health, challenging behaviors, and ultimately disruptions in life. So, understanding the realities of trauma and moving beyond just the response to recovery is very critical. So, how does trauma happen? Well, trauma, like we talked about, starts with an event, but it's not trauma unless there is a traumatic response and traumatic stress. So, if you think back to this previous slide, you can insert this particular diagram between the response, traumatic stress categories. How trauma happens is complicated, and it depends on previous traumatic experiences, on social supports that people may have in place or not, opportunities that people have in their communities for treatment and recovery, the duration and dosage of the exposure, how long it happens, if it's short term or if it's long term. And this idea of a critical trauma assumes that trauma is always there, it's always present in the form of persistent threats. And examples of those persistent threats are like racism and discrimination, or poverty, or sexism. So the diagram that you see here shows 5 different responses that have been described by trauma experts. I assume that most of you, because most people do, understand or have heard of a fight or flight response when someone feels danger or feels threatened. So recent advances in trauma and how we understand trauma responses has expanded those responses to include flop, freeze, and fawn. So as you see here, we go back to fight. Fight means that a person defends their position in response to the threat. Over time, if folks aren't treated for the trauma, then this could look like narcissism or bullying behavior or rage. For those who respond with fleeing or flight from a threat, over time, this could look like they're avoiding, or they're always distracted, or they're seeking perfection. They develop addictions, or they just stay busy all the time. To fawn describes how a person relinquishes to the threat. So over time, this could look like someone who is a people pleaser. They have codependencies. They repress themselves oftentimes. Freeze describes when a person has what some may describe or talk about as an out-of-body experience. And over time, this person could look like someone who shuts down or dissociates from the event. They may not forget, they may forget what happened, the trauma that they experienced, or they may forget certain major details. Finally, to flop means that a person just loses physical control of their body during the threat. They may faint or go limp. If you've heard about a possum fainting or passing out or appearing dead, this puts you in the mind of a flop response. Over time, the behavior may repeat when perceived threats are overwhelming for folks. So it is important to be familiar with these responses so that when they show up, you can recognize them as trauma responses and not dismiss individuals as being difficult or challenging. So who does trauma impact? Well, everyone is impacted by trauma. We all have had our own experiences or near experiences with trauma. So we all know someone who's been impacted by trauma. But there are those of us who have other vulnerabilities that make us more susceptible to the trauma. And it's important for us to understand that culture, race, gender, ability, citizenship, and other isms matter when discussing trauma and trauma responses. And in addition to that, like I talked about earlier, poverty is a type of vulnerability that could make people more susceptible to adverse trauma experience and outcomes. So, where and when does trauma happen? Well, trauma can literally happen anywhere at any time. If you think about the world we live in, it's very unpredictable. Trauma exposures are most always unplanned and unexpected. If the movie clip is an example of anytime, anywhere, the students were experiencing and responding to trauma that they were exposed to in their dreams. That may be an unconventional example, but it's in no way ridiculous or impossible. So what does trauma look or feel like? Well, for individuals who experience trauma, some describe feeling hopeless and helpless. Others may dissociate from the experience and the response. They may avoid the trauma, or they're unable to even acknowledge that it happened. Some individuals may present with grandiose ideas of their importance and an inability to really empathize with others. It may sound like someone who has this symptom may sound like, that happened to me. Whoever has that, the same thing happened to me, so they should just get over it like I did and let it go. Others may present with anger, or fear, guilt, or on guard all the time, ready to fight, quick to anger. And then other folks may describe feeling just physically exhausted. They may explain that they are having trouble concentrating or listening, which will make completing seemingly simple tasks very difficult. So many of these symptoms may make someone present as troubled or challenging and difficult to deal with. And we may describe them as lazy or uncooperative or emotionally sensitive and fragile. But what I want you to do is when you hear people describe or share their experiences in this way, instead of thinking the worst, think trauma. So I want you to take note of this list of trauma symptoms. It's a more comprehensive list, but in no way exhaustive, okay? So traumatic stress impacts individuals both behaviorally, physically, cognitively, and psychologically. Some of these symptoms we already mentioned, but others like isolation and withdrawal and insomnia, intrusive thoughts and confusion, or even depression could impact someone's ability to function as they typically would. These are symptoms that you may see in others or in yourself if you've had a trauma exposure. It's important to recognize these symptoms because so that you or someone you encounter can get help sooner than later. Remember that recovery is always the goal. Recovery is always possible, but it takes a lot of effort and early intervention works. So don't dismiss the signs. Okay. So, untreated symptoms of traumatic stress can lead to a number of outcomes. And this includes things like substance abuse, folks who are just hostile, impulsive and self destructive behaviors, and inability to make healthy choices, withdrawal from social supports, an inability to maintain healthy, close relationships or choose appropriate friendships. So these untreated symptoms can exacerbate other stressful aspects of a person's life, including work, school, and family life, leading individuals into a spiral of adverse outcomes that compromise their overall wellness. So within organizations, as employees, we're expected to do the work of the organization. And that may mean that we encounter situations where we are introduced to people who have experienced trauma and are experiencing traumatic stress. And because trauma is so complex, you can have an exposure just by witnessing someone else's trauma. So secondhand trauma is an exposure to one person's trauma, where you may have a short-term response that initially upsets you, but is quickly resolved. But over time, if you continue to experience multiple people's trauma and more trauma just compounded on top, you could experience vicarious trauma. And when you experience vicarious trauma, your worldview eventually changes. Things that you used to believe about yourself and the world around you can begin to change. People who experience vicarious trauma will have a prolonged response and a difficult time moving past the trauma they witnessed. Vicarious trauma happens over time and can cause a person great distress. So it's important to acknowledge and manage secondhand and vicarious trauma because it can lead to burnout and compassion fatigue, and that can lead to an ineffective workplace with low productivity and very high turnover. So how do you reduce the risk? So to reduce the risk of secondary vicarious trauma, we have to develop strategies around peer support, supervision, training, therapy, and balance and boundaries. So peer support refers to maintaining social supports to prevent isolation and depression. Supervision encourages you to seek support from your supervisor in your workplace to help you understand your own responses to other people's trauma and remain productive in the workplace. This could also look like professional coaching outside of your workplace. Participating in ongoing professional training can improve your belief in your abilities and capacity to contribute to the organization. Engaging in personal therapy can help you manage your own experiences with trauma, your own healing and recovery. And maintaining a healthy, balanced lifestyle can make you more prepared to manage difficult situations in your workplace. Eat well, get adequate sleep, all the things that we hear about, right? To keep ourselves healthy, exercise, and find joy in life are all examples of activities to help you maintain balance. And then setting clear limits and boundaries mean that you clearly separate your personal and work life to allow time for rejuvenation. You must also commit to self-care, right? You commit to self-care by guarding your boundaries, by leaning into saying no when necessary. I tell my students and clients all the time that no is not a dirty word. Sometimes we feel like we just can't say no, but sometimes you have to say no in order to protect your boundaries, to guard your boundaries. Create a daily schedule that includes breaks for you to rest, get exercise, connect socially, and engage with any hobbies that you may have. If you don't have a hobby, try to find one. It's a great outlet to relieve stress and take care of yourself. Encourage leadership in your organization to model and uphold a self-care routine. This modeling creates an organizational culture that people matter above all else. If you don't have people well enough to do the work, then the work doesn't happen. So people have to matter above all else. And then finally, self-care is an ethical imperative. You can't pour from an empty cup. So if you're not caring for yourself, how can you care for others who may need you to make sound decisions? Okay. All right. So that wraps up our discussion about trauma. So in less than a minute, let's use the chat to talk about who we think, based on what we just talked about, who you think is impacted by trauma, and name 2 symptoms of trauma that really stood out for you. Oh, wow, yeah. Yeah, everyone impacted directly, indirectly. Yeah, anyone. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. Yeah. So while everything is not trauma and trauma is not a trend and um it's not everywhere, if you know where to look, you can really see and um be impactful when it comes to recognizing trauma and helping other people to recognize where it's showing up. And it's important to be able to do that because as we move into this next session, thank you all for sharing. Please feel free to continue to share. As we move into this next session, we're going to section of this talk, we're going to talk about a trauma-informed approach. And so one of the first steps to understanding a trauma-informed approach is understanding what trauma is and what we're looking for when it comes to trauma. Oh, somebody's talking about little and big T traumas. I love it. You all have some experience. I love it. Yeah, I love it. Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about what it means to be trauma informed and what a trauma informed approach is. Okay, so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, defines trauma informed as a program, organization, or system that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for healing, that recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in staff, clients, and others involved with the system, and that responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. Policies, procedures, practices, and settings. Sorry. So that's SAMHSA's definition. But SAMHSA did a great job in kind of paring that down because that definition is a lot to remember. So they came up with the 4 R's assumptions, and these are key assumptions in a trauma-informed approach. So the first R is realizing. You're realizing the prevalence of trauma. That's some of what we just talked about, is the prevalence and trying to realize that. recognizing how trauma affects individuals. That's some of the work that we just did in the previous section. Responding or translating what we know about trauma into practice. That's where we're moving to and talking about a trauma-informed approach and how applying what we know about trauma into practice with people around us or people that we encounter in the organizations we're in. And the final R is resisting. Resisting at all cost. Well, not at all costs, but resisting as much as possible, as humanly possible, right? Re-traumatization and re-traumatizing people that we encounter. Okay. So what are the characteristics of a trauma-informed organization? Let's just kind of start there, right? So a trauma-informed organization is, of course, based on the 4Rs assumption and begins with the ethical principle of doing no harm. Okay, so everyone in a trauma-informed organization demonstrates a trauma-informed approach. That means that everybody from the receptionists, the people who answer the phones and respond to emails, interns, the custodial staff, building security, leadership in the building. If you have board members, your board members, any partners, that means that everyone in the organization and working through the organization must assume the 4Rs of a trauma-informed approach. An organization's policies, procedures, and practices must also demonstrate the 4Rs assumption to protect the vulnerabilities of people who engage with the organization and those who work for the organization. This may require that policies, procedures, and practices are redesigned with input from people within and outside of the organization and across the hierarchy of the organization to minimize opportunities for re-traumatization. A trauma-informed organization also commits to building staff competencies around trauma-informed principles. This requires a commitment of resources to ongoing training and evaluation of organizational culture through a trauma-aware lens. So when we accomplish this, we have a trauma-informed organization that will bring about systemic change by creating a trauma-informed community that's committed to improving outcomes for the people that they touch. So why be a trauma-informed organization? Now that we know what they are, why be one? Becoming a trauma-informed organization sends a very powerful, positive message that your organization has a commitment to treating individuals and their concerns with humanity, dignity, and compassion, and that your organization provides a safe and welcoming environment. In trauma-informed organizations, everyone can competently manage traumatic experiences and reactions to effectively meet everyone's needs and ensure that everyone is seen and heard in the organizational environment. By promoting respectful interactions through a trauma-informed organizational community, the organization contributes positively to people's trauma recovery and is better able to retain employees, partners, and clients. So SAMHSA, also building on this idea of being trauma-informed, has described 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach that support organizations in creating systemic change through a trauma-informed lens. The first, of course, is safety. Organizations that are trauma-informed extend safety to their stakeholders, to their staff, and partners. The organization implements practices that ensure that people are physically and psychologically safe. The second principle is trustworthiness and transparency, and this extends to organizational operations and decision-making with the goal of building and maintaining trust with stakeholders, staff, and others involved in the organization. The third principle is peer support and mutual self-help. These are important to establishing safety, building trust, and enhancing collaboration within an organization. Organizations that allow space for individuals with shared experiences to offer support and help each other are creating systemic change within their organization through a trauma-informed approach. Affinity groups, if you've heard of affinity groups, these are an example of peer support and mutual self-help groups that are grounded in trauma-informed principles. The fourth principle is collaboration and mutuality. This principle acknowledges that power dynamics exist in organizations for work accountability, and they're necessary. However, when you adopt a trauma-informed approach, it encourages a leveling in the power dynamics within the organization that don't impede work accountability, but build partnerships across the organizational hierarchy so that everyone feels safe and heard. And the fifth principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. And this recognizes and builds on individuals' strengths and experiences. A trauma-informed organization fosters a belief in the primacy of the people and the ability of individuals, organizations, and communities to heal and promote recovery from trauma. The final principle is cultural, historical, and gender. Trauma-informed organizations actively move past cultural stereotypes and biases that are based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, religion, gender identity, geography, etc., etc. You fill in the blank. And this is because we want to. So an example of this is offering access to gender responsive services. Another example is leveraging the healing value of traditional cultural connections, incorporating policies, protocols, and processes that are responsive to racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of individuals, and recognizing and addressing historical trauma. So in addition to the key principles of a trauma-informed approach, SAMHSA also recommends 10 implementation domains of a trauma-informed approach. So when an organization decides to commit to creating a trauma-informed agency, an initial infrastructure to initiate support and guide changes should be created. This involves key stakeholders and consumers with previous trauma experiences and/or expertise. There should be an assessment of the extent that the organization's current policies, procedures, and operations either support or interfere with the development of a trauma-informed approach. An implementation plan should be developed with ongoing support from collaborators, including employees, consumers, partners, and community agencies. Once the plan is put into action, the organization should participate in continuous reassessments, implement quality improvement measures as needed, and identify areas of implementation that they found challenging. Finally, the organization should institute practices that support sustainability of a trauma-informed organization, including ongoing training, consumer participation and feedback, and resource allocation. And that's not just money, but also time. Okay. So Trauma-Informed Oregon created a table, and this is an excerpt from the table, to help organizations develop a trauma-informed lens. So they created this table based on frequently reported experiences of their training participants for organizations to use as a guide. So I pulled 3 examples based on the 3 categories of the tables to share with you here today. So the first one is individuals, the second one is providers, employees, and partners, and the last is the organization's environment. If you're interested in learning more about Trauma-Informed Oregon or to gain access to the full table, I included the website down in the footer. Please feel free to check that out. It's a great table and has a lot of good information in it, lots of tools. So this first example that I borrowed from Trauma-Informed Oregon's table is one that presents an individual. And so if in your organization, an individual begins expressing aggressive behavior or appears angry or upset without warning, A trauma-informed response would be that this person is violent or defiant or difficult, right? But if we're shifting to a trauma-informed lens, we begin to think about it from that perspective. We realize, oh, wow, this person feels unsafe. This person, for some reason, has been triggered. Maybe they feel helpless. So, what do you do? Well, one strategy is that you can help them find a safe place, a safe, quiet space where they can de-escalate and catch their breath and understand and find some safety so that they can start to come down and realize, okay, I'm in a safe place, this is okay, and to be able to verbalize what's happening. Another one is to maybe reduce triggers, reduce the opportunity for triggers in your workspace. And that means that you have to assess what's going on in your workspace. And then the other is to just be transparent and explicit with people. Let them know what's really happening. Tell the truth. But above all, please don't make promises. Making promises, I promise that everything will be okay, is not a good idea. I caution everyone, my students, I drill this into them every semester. Please don't ever make promises because it's difficult for us as human beings to keep promises. And for trauma, people who've experienced trauma, and especially trauma that's compounded over years and decades, they've experienced broken promises. So don't be a part of that narrative for them. So but just be transparent and very explicit. Just be as honest as you possibly can. Okay. So the next example is of a service provider, an employee or a partner agency employee. And this person is displaying a mood swing or an outburst or blaming others for unintended consequences. So, a non trauma informed response would be that this person, oh, they're not a team player. They're so bossy. They're just a control freak or just so unprofessional. All of these things I know you've heard in your workplaces, right? Um, but if we shift to a trauma-informed lens, we remember that, wait, this person may be a trauma survivor, or this person may be experiencing vicarious trauma based on the work that they do and the communities that they work with. And maybe they haven't had an opportunity to have access to recovery resources, and so they haven't learned to regulate their emotions, and so they're doing the best that they can given the circumstances. So what strategies could you use in that case? Well, you could be creative and flexible, right? Be amenable, be flexible. Okay, well, maybe today is not a good day for us to meet. How's tomorrow? How's next week, right? Give people an opportunity to kind of regroup because we really don't know what the triggers are. So opening space and allowing folks to just kind of have some time is really valuable. Ensure that workforce wellness resources are available, that people have time off, that people have access to resources in the workplace. And then another strategy is to make sure and to encourage folks to get ongoing traumatic stress and vicarious trauma training. The more you know, the better able you are to address trauma when you see it. Okay. And the last example that from Trauma Informed Oregon is in the organizational environment and how that can be triggering. So if you're in your lobby or where you have people coming in, or even in your with your staff, if the chairs are too close, right? Or if the doors are locked in order for you to enter and exit the building, that could trigger someone with a trauma history. So a non-trauma response would be, oh, well, we have limited space, we have limited resources, this is all we can do. And the doors are locked for our safety because we're in a, not so safe place, neighborhood. And so we lock the doors for safety. But a trauma-informed lens says, okay, wow, shared spaces could cause some people discomfort because we don't know what types of trauma people have experienced. And so acknowledging that people may be coming into the space hypervigilant. We don't know where they came from. We don't know what happened before they got here. So how do we help them find comfort in the organizational environment? So one thing is to identify early those environmental stressors, right? what could trigger someone. And that's when you work with community, you work with experts, you work with people who've had the experiences of trauma to come in and say, yeah, this could trigger someone, right? You want to ensure that folks have adequate personal space. It may be rearranging the chairs in the office space, given the limited space, but how can we do better, right? Or set expectations for people about the environment. If you've invited someone to come to your office who may have a trigger, may have a trauma experience or previous experience with trauma, you could say, hey, listen, it's kind of tight in our office. If you want to wait outside until I'm ready for you, I'll call you call me when you get here and I'll let you know so that you don't have to come in and be triggered by that, right? So there are ways in which that really don't disrupt our day-to-day operations, but it's just a different way of looking at things and a different way of operating. Okay. So one of the things I want you to remember, if you don't take away anything, take away that all behavior comes from someplace. It has an origin story. Typically, we don't see trauma. We experience someone's behavior as a result of their trauma experience. And that's often because they're unresolved and they may even be unaware that that they've been exposed to trauma and that their responses are trauma responses. So a trauma-informed organization asks the question, what happened to you? Not what's wrong with you, right? One, like what happened to you denotes this sense of resilience and survival, and it's a more personalized approach. Whereas what's wrong with you is more around like pathology. You're pathologizing people, and it's more of a depersonalized consumer approach to people and their behavior. So healing happens in relationship. So if we're going to use trauma-informed strategies, these trauma-informed strategies really help to build relationships with individuals. And employing a strengths perspective, trauma-informed organizations acknowledge that challenging behaviors are likely a trauma response, and those trauma responses are reflecting their creativity, the individual's creativity, and their ability to preserve themselves, and their determination, and their humanity. That's a strengths perspective in looking at trauma survivors. So we should never be blaming and shaming, because blaming and shaming has no room in a trauma-informed approach. So how does systemic change happen in trauma-informed organizations? Now that we know what they are, now that we've had examples of what a trauma-informed lens looks like as opposed to a non-trauma informed lens, how does systemic change happen? Well, I imagine you all can imagine that once your organization has implemented a trauma-informed approach, you'll notice changes in the people that engage with your organization because they feel safe, they feel welcomed. You'll find that individuals are empowered to advocate for themselves and others with more clarity and resolve because they're experiencing some level of healing just by engaging in a trauma-informed organization. They're able to make decisions and set goals and manage their progress towards their goals. The organization becomes more productive and the work is more meaningful as the organizational hierarchy is reimagined with an emphasis on partnership and relationship, and space is created to hear all voices. Your trauma-informed organization now exudes this culture of care and safety and respect, and systemic change is inevitable. So as we wrap up, I'd like for you to remember that each of us have had some experience with trauma, whether that was directly or indirectly. And because of the complexity of trauma, we each have had a different reaction and outcome, but that doesn't make the experience more or less impactful. So before you meet a challenging response with a challenge, right, consider that maybe trauma is the cause and don't take it personal, because in most cases, it's not. Think from a strengths perspective. Try to find something positive to help the person move from that place of trigger to safety. It could be something as simple as thanking them for being there today or complimenting their dress or appearance. Being trauma informed is all about creating space for safety for everyone. Enable individuals to regain their sense of control and empowerment. Don't lose sight of the goal of the encounter. Above all, avoid re traumatizing and re triggering as much as possible. It may be difficult in the beginning, but the more you practice trauma informed strategies that are presented here to you today and keep getting the training around trauma and trauma informed strategies, the work will become easier. It'll be like second nature. You won't it'll just start happening. It'll become a way of life, and you'll do it inside work and outside work. It'll just be a part of who you are. And always remember, as Marsha Woodland, she's the board of directors, founder, and consultant at Building Bridges Foundation, a local trauma recovery group or agency in Washington, D.C. area. She said that hope should never diminish hope. And that's always been such a powerful statement for me. And I really lead with that because if I'm trying to help, how my help should never diminish how someone's hope for a better tomorrow. So I want to thank you all for your attentiveness. This has been so great. I want to thank the team at AmeriCorps for inviting me to be here. This has been amazing. At this time, I'd like to invite our moderator, Stedman Ware. I think, Stedman, are you here or is it?
I am here, yes.
Okay, Stedman's here. Stedman's going to begin our Q&A session. So I look forward to hearing from you all.
All right, all right, all right. So thank you so much. I'm super excited to facilitate Q&A. But I also want to bring focus to the link that Misty put in the chat for our survey. Please, 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 before you leave, please, 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 please complete this survey. We need your feedback. We want to know, we want to hear from you. We want to know how we can make these communities more engaging, more successful, and more accessible to all of you. Yes, please, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to click on that link and complete this survey before we move forward. I want to thank each of you for submitting questions to the Q&A also. We have quite a few, so we may not get to every one of them, but I hope we can. Just depends on how much time we have left. But please, again, just take a moment to complete that short survey. And the link has been pasted a couple of times in the chat, so please do so. And we'll just give you another minute or so before we hop into Q&A. All righty. So this will be a quick one, Dr. Michelle. Is it possible to get a copy of the slides? I know that's not something we usually provide in the follow-up, but I wanted to know if you will be providing your information and if they can reach out to you personally.
Absolutely. Should I put it in the chat or?
That's perfect. That would be
Okay.
great.
Okay.
If you're okay with that, only if you're okay with that. And I'm like, so I just hopefully you are.
Yeah, sure. I'll my email. I'm sorry, I hit.
Perfect. So if it's okay, I'm gonna move on to the next question, okay?
Okay.
All right. Our organization did some training on trauma-informed care back in 2021. We haven't re-engaged with a trainer or the material since then. What would you recommend for frequency and quantity of training for our staff so they understand how to apply this trauma-related knowledge to the workplace? And I will
Yeah.
put that question, that's a long one. I'm gonna put that in the chat also in case you can't see it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't know that I have a recommendation as far as because it's really hard to say, oh, yeah, you should do it once a year, you should do it twice a year. Because I'm not, it would depend on the organization and resources and the like. But I would say at least once a year to have, even if it's just a 30-minute check-in with the team to say, hey, remember this? Let's talk about this again, see where we are. To kind of just reevaluate if folks are really using the strategies and if they've if they really are still understanding, because I guess because I've had so much trauma training and I've done so much, I would do 2 or 3 a year because, well, that's what I do, right? But so now it is just a part of how I operate. And so I say the more that you have, the better you are, the better able you are, the better you are able to implement the practices, and it just becomes second nature. So I would say as much as you could possibly get. If you can do it every year, absolutely every year. If you can do it every 6 months, like a refresher, do it every 6 months. I know some agencies offer train the trainer um opportunities. And so if someone in your office is able to be trained as a trauma-informed trainer, you may be able to have access to more training on a regular basis. So that's an option too. Because I was trained as a trainer and was able to go out and continue training in my agency. So that may be another way to get around it, especially if resources are tight and you don't really have an opportunity to bring people from the outside in all the time. I hope that's helpful.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So the next question is, can you talk a little bit about generational trauma and how it shows up in later generations?
Hmm.
And we actually got a couple of questions about this.
Yeah, so this is part of my other work. Like the quote that I started with Dr. Resma Menakem, it becomes culture, right? And so in order for folks to tease out what is trauma and what's culture, you really have to dig deep into things that happened as community, right? So and even generational trauma within families become, like he said, family traits. So it can be difficult to do, and it's one of those things that you would really need someone from the outside to help you with. So I highly recommend getting into therapy. One of the things is, I tell clients all the time, your parents, your grandparents were whole human beings before you came along with whole lives that you have no access and no idea. They can't tell you everything they experience. And so it's really hard to unpack some of those things sometimes because they just don't have language for it. And so if you know someone who's experiencing or going through something that they believe to be generational trauma, I highly recommend that you have a conversation with a counselor, a therapist, um, and lead with that I think this is something I saw it in my, in my family line, and folks behave this way and it was normalized. And I really I want to unpack it for me. um, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but generational trauma is a thing. And I'm a geneticist too by training in my previous life. And we know that it's biological too, it's passed down. Um, so there's a lot there to talk about. We could have a whole session on generational trauma in and of itself. Um, but I highly recommend that you have conversation. And if you're able to recognize it, that's a great start because that's where you can start in talking about those things. But I want you to go into that remembering and encourage people to go in that remembering that, everybody has an origin story. And when I talk about shaming and blaming, that does more harm than good. So how do you remove that part of it and really get to the meat and potatoes of what this is, how I'm experiencing it, and how I cannot pass it on?
Absolutely. I know we all can relate to that, for sure. All right. So the next question, have you ever worked with an organization that was very resistant to being trauma informed?
Mm.
And they referenced sort of like a correctional facility setting,
Mm.
for example. If so, what do you think the resistance is based on?
Yes, I have. I worked in corrections. A lot of the work that I've done has been in corrections. And I think that, okay, how do I say this nicely? Everybody has a way of training their professionals. They do it for a reason. Um, and I think that the resistance is just embedded in the nature of the work and the way they talk about the work. So for helpers like us, they're not necessarily helpers. They are there for law and order. And that's a very different approach than someone who is concerned about well-being. Um, and so it is very challenging to help those correction professionals and law enforcement professionals to really appreciate how trauma informed can really change the way that they do their work in a positive way and get positive results from um, the people that they are serving inside it, in corrections and law enforcement. Um, it's really difficult if they don't acknowledge that this is something that's important and you introduce it as this is important, you're probably going to get more resistance than if it's coming from the outside as opposed to the inside, you probably will get more resistance. But it's just about information, um, infiltrating them with information, keep the pressure on that this is important. That's been my experience is in breaking down those barriers. But most folks in corrections, they try to do the best they can and they're doing a great job, but I don't know. I don't know.
So, I understand it's very difficult,
It's
and I
difficult.
mean, depending on, and certainly depending on the type of organization you're working
Yeah.
with. We kind of got a flood of questions at the last minute, so unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them. But I'm going to put again Dr. Sermon's email. I would encourage, and most of them are written anonymously anyway, so which we are completely fine with. I would encourage you all to either reach out to Dr. Sermon directly if you do want that question answered, or you're welcome to reach out to us in the ODEIA email, which hopefully one of my colleagues can grab really quickly. If I don't know that I can get to it, but I think that's the last one we can take. Well, this last one is where. Okay, this will be the last one. Where's Dr. Sermon an associate professor?
At the Bowie State University in Maryland, in Bowie, Maryland.
Perfect, perfect.
Yeah.
Dr. Sermon, thank you so much for enlightening us and for providing us with your valuable insight. We so appreciate you for being here. And again, I would encourage all of you to follow up with Dr. Sermon if need be. So before we go, I want to welcome our acting CDIO, Anthony Hines, to close us out.
Thank you for that, Seven. And thank you, Dr. Summerton, for taking the time to speak with us here today. Hello again, AmeriCorps. My name is Anthony Hines. I'm currently acting as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. I want to thank you all for showing up here today, whether you were actively participating via these reactions, chats, Q&As, or just in general reflecting with your intentions. Your contributions are greatly appreciated. Let's continue to grow these cultural learning community, the cultural learning communities and these communities by sharing your feedback and encouraging registration and participation in future events. I would ask you all, please mark your calendars. We hold these sessions every third Thursday of the month. And next month, on August 15th, we will be discussing gender and sexual identity. We're going to go through what fundamentally, AmeriCorps' mission is the obligation to honor the diversity of all stakeholders by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This course will provide a better understanding of gender and sexual identity related to terms and discussions and in ways to introduce inclusive language to signal a welcoming and respectful environment for all. I really hope to see you all there. Don't wait. Our registration, just as you registered here, is up and open for you to do so. And I'll see you all next third Thursday in August. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anthony.